After her father passed away, the little girl only asked for a portion of food, but she was immediately shoved to the ground by her stepmother and her lover. Her white dress was smeared with mud, her body trembling under the stream of curses while leftover food was thrown straight onto her head. The shouting and insults echoed without end, until a millionaire witnessed that cruel scene and did this. A week had passed since the funeral of painter Christopher Morales came to a close. The renowned man, admired in the art world for both his talent and kindness, was now only a painful memory in the suburban mansion. The funeral wreaths had withered, leaving behind the lingering scent of white chrysanthemums and the familiar tang of oil paint in the vast house, as if time itself had not yet managed to wash away the loss. At the end of the hallway, the studio where he had spent most of his life creating celebrated works, and where Charlotte often curled up in her father's arms, still carried traces of his warmth, as though he had just stepped out yesterday. Charlotte, the 6-year-old girl with wide blue eyes, sat huddled in that room. The paint-stained cloth her father used still held the pungent smell of oil. She clutched it tightly against her chest, as if it were the last thread connecting her to him. The studio was vast. The easels still held unfinished canvases, the colors not yet dry, everything frozen in the state it had been when he was suddenly taken by a heart attack. Charlotte closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wooden chair where she used to sit beside her father. In her mind, old memories surged back with piercing clarity. Her father sat before the easel, the brush moving in confident strokes, golden light falling gently across the canvas. He turned, smiling, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Sweetheart, every painting has a soul, just like you." Charlotte had laughed then, resting her head against his shoulder. Her tiny hands were smeared with paint, but she was happy, delighted that he let her add a few strokes to the canvas. That world belonged only to the two of them, a place no one could intrude upon, where love flowed through every breath. Now the house was suffocatingly silent. Her father's laughter no longer rang through the rooms, his hand no longer ruffled her hair. Charlotte felt as though she had been left adrift in a dark void where only fear surrounded her. Clutching the cloth tighter, she whispered softly, almost as if speaking to herself, "Daddy, I miss you so much. I'm so scared." The sudden sound of the door opening made her flinch. The sharp click of high heels struck the wooden floor, echoing through the hushed room. Jessica appeared. She was 36, slender, her blonde hair falling in soft curls. Her lips painted a bold red, and she wore a tight, fashionable crimson dress. Jessica was Charlotte's stepmother, the woman Christopher had married after years of raising his daughter alone. Charlotte's mother had died giving birth, leaving behind a newborn who would grow up without a mother's embrace. But from the moment Jessica entered this house, she had never once treated Charlotte as her own. Even at the funeral, while others wept for Christopher, she kept her eyes fixed on her phone screen, whispering into it as if nothing else mattered. Jessica stood at the doorway, her eyes sweeping over the small child clutching a painted cloth. She curled her lips, her voice sharp, each word cutting through the silence. "Why are you still sitting here? This room belongs to me now." Charlotte startled, tightening her grip on the cloth. Her voice trembled, weak and close to tears. "Please, Mom, just let me keep a few of Dad's drawings. I promise I'll hide them carefully. I won't bother anyone." Jessica stepped fully inside, the harsh scent of her perfume stinging Charlotte's nose. She bent down, leaning close, her gaze cold. "These drawings mean money, and money belongs to me. You have no right. Do you understand?" Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes, her hands shaking as she clutched the remaining sketches on the table. They were drawings her father had made just for her, innocent faces, little scenes tied to her childhood. She trembled, shaking her head, whispering a plea. "I only want to keep them. They're memories of Dad." Jessica snapped her hand out, tearing a sheet straight from the bundle. It was the sketch of Charlotte at 5 years old, her round face, her bright eyes, her wide smile. Christopher had once spent hours smiling at that very drawing. In Jessica's hands, the page crumpled without mercy. The ripping sound of paper, crushed and tossed to the floor, echoed harshly in the room. "Don't dream that any of this will ever belong to you." Charlotte burst into sobs, dropping to her knees to gather the wrinkled sheet. Her tiny hands trembled as she tried in vain to smooth it flat. memories shredded right before her eyes. Jessica straightened, pulling out her phone to make a call. Her tone shifted instantly, sweet as honey. "Jack, let's meet this afternoon." "Yes, wear the blue suit I love. I'll be waiting. Love you." Looking into the mirror, touching up her lipstick, Jessica ignored the child sobbing on the floor. Charlotte dared not raise her head. She quietly sank into her familiar wooden chair, pulled out a small notebook hidden in her shirt, and gripped a pencil with trembling fingers. Crooked letters formed across the blank page. "Dad, I don't want to stay in this house. Without you, everything is so frightening." Tears spilled down, blurring the words, staining the paper. She bowed her head against the notebook, her frail shoulders shaking with each sob. At the door, Jessica snapped her mirror shut, her eyes flashing with irritation. She turned back, glaring at Charlotte with disdain. Her red lips curved slightly, as if calculating something even crueler than tearing apart the drawings. That afternoon, a strange man appeared in the house. He walked in with a confident stride, wearing a fitted blue suit, a tightly knotted tie, and hair slicked back to shine. This was Jack, a man in his late 30s who had once been a forgettable associate in a small brokerage firm. But ever since he became involved with Jessica, Jack had changed, dressing himself in elegance and pretending to be someone of higher status. The moment he saw Charlotte standing on the staircase, Jack smirked, his laugh far from friendly. He walked closer, bent down, and spoke in a voice that sounded sweet but carried mockery. "Little girl, you need to learn how to behave properly. This house has no place for childish nonsense anymore." Charlotte shrank back, clutching her small notebook tightly against her chest. She didn't reply, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jack whistled, then gave her shoulder a pat, the gesture appearing friendly but his hand pressed with enough force to make her stumble. "Don't make me teach you how to behave. Your father spoiled you too much, and that has to change." Charlotte's blue eyes welled with tears. She took a small step back, not knowing what to say. Jack, satisfied by her fear, turned on his heel and walked toward the living room, where Jessica was waiting. That evening, the dining table in the mansion was set lavishly. The chandelier glowed brightly. Elegant dishes were laid out, and the faint aroma of wine hung in the air. Jessica appeared in a sheer red silk nightgown, sitting beside Jack, laughing freely as if the house had never known grief. They clinked glasses, whispered strange words to each other, ignoring Charlotte, who sat at the far end of the table. In front of the little girl was only a bowl of cold rice and a few scraps of meat. She bowed her head in silence, lifting the spoon to eat small bites, forcing herself to swallow. Jack glanced over, jerked his chin, and snapped, "This kid eats like a beggar. Hurry up and finish, then clear the table." Charlotte gripped her spoon tighter, holding back her sobs. In a trembling voice she whispered, I'm not full yet. I'm still hungry." Jessica let out a sharp laugh, raised her glass of wine for a sip, then stared directly at Charlotte, her voice icy cold. "Children should know their place. Don't let me hear another complaint." The words fell onto the dinner table like a blade, cutting across Charlotte's small throat. She lowered her head and tried to eat faster, tears falling into the bowl of rice. In her heart, only one thought echoed: if Dad were still alive. The dinner was filled with the hollow laughter of Jessica and Jack, while at the far end of the table, a child swallowed every bite in humiliation. When clearing the table, Charlotte's trembling hands carefully gathered the plates, but as her tiny fingers brushed against a wine glass, it slipped from her grasp and shattered across the floor. Jessica jumped up and shouted, "Stop being so clumsy. You're making me lose my patience." Jack stepped forward, leaning close to Charlotte's face, his tone sharp with anger. "You really are nothing but a burden. Just like worthless trash." Charlotte lowered her head, trembling, too afraid to fight back. That night, the house sank into silence. Jessica and Jack were still laughing and chatting in the living room, music from the speakers echoing down the hallway. Charlotte quietly went back to her room. She sat by the window, looking down at the street. Outside, a few neighborhood kids were playing tag, their laughter carried by the night breeze. Charlotte rested her chin on her knees and whispered softly, "I wish I could be as free as they are." Her blue eyes glistened, staring out into the world while her heart twisted in pain. She no longer had a father, no protection, only her drawings and her small notebook as companions. Charlotte opened the notebook and wrote a few short lines. "Dad, today they scolded me again. I only wanted to eat a little more, but they called me a beggar. I feel so small, Dad." Her trembling hand set the pen down. She lay back on the bed, clutching the notebook to her chest. The ticking of the clock echoed in the long night. Suddenly, the door burst open. Jack walked in without warning, his leather shoes thudding hard against the floor. The smell of alcohol still clung to him, his face flushed red but his eyes cold and sharp. He scanned the room, then stopped when he saw Charlotte clutching the notebook. Jack strode quickly over and yanked the notebook out of her hands. "What's this? What kind of nonsense are you scribbling?" Charlotte jumped up, rushing after him, her voice breaking. "Give it back." "That's mine." Jack flipped through a few pages and sneered. Nothing but useless words. "Do you really think writing this garbage will make anyone pity you?" Charlotte burst into tears, desperately trying to grab the notebook back, but her small strength was no match. Jack shoved her down onto the bed, his voice low and threatening. "One day, I'll make sure you understand what real humiliation feels like." He stuffed the notebook into his jacket pocket and turned to leave, abandoning the room in darkness. Charlotte covered her face, crying, her trembling hands reaching for the empty space where the notebook had just been. A vague, terrifying fear rose inside her, a nightmare that had only just begun and from which she had no idea when she would escape. In the suffocating night, Jack's fading laughter echoed like a warning, leaving Charlotte shivering in the cold room, her eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, wondering what other horrors awaited her in the days to come. The small room where Charlotte had been locked for days was sealed tight, with only a narrow window letting in a dim trace of light. She curled up on an old wooden chair, her stomach growling endlessly, her head spinning. For days, Jessica had only tossed her a few scraps of stale bread and a cup of cold water, never enough to keep her going. Each time Charlotte whispered that she was hungry, Jack would sneer and say, "Hunger is your problem. This house has no place for freeloaders." Charlotte tried to endure it, but the hunger grew more violent with every passing hour. Her stomach twisted in pain, making her sob quietly as she clutched her father's old scarf, the only thing that still held a trace of warmth and familiarity. In her mind, she could almost smell the chicken soup her father used to make, remembering the way he would ladle her an extra spoonful with a smile and say, "Eat up, sweetheart. You need a full belly if you want to paint." The longing and emptiness blurred her small eyes with tears. That night, she could not sleep. Darkness wrapped around her, her empty stomach pounding like a drum, making every minute stretch into eternity. Charlotte leaned against the wall and whispered, "Daddy, I'm so hungry. I just wish I could eat with you one more time." The next morning, while Jessica and Jack were busy putting on makeup and dressing in fancy clothes to head to Christopher's old restaurant, now under new ownership, Charlotte quietly trailed behind them. Her legs trembled, but the desperate hope of having a real meal outweighed her fear. The elegant restaurant loomed before her. It had once been the place where her father created a paradise for orphans, a haven where children could come and eat for free. Now, under Jessica's hand, it had become nothing more than a stage for vanity and indulgence. Charlotte stopped at the entrance, hesitating as she watched the steady stream of guests going in and out. The smell of food spread through the air, twisting her stomach tighter, tears filling her eyes. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped inside. The interior glowed with the brilliance of crystal chandeliers, and the guests were dressed in extravagant fashion. Tiny Charlotte was swallowed up in the crowd, wearing her old white dress, stained and dusty. Curious, pitying stares turned her way, making her shrink even more. She looked around and thought of her father. She could almost see him again, standing behind the counter near the kitchen, happily ladling soup and placing it into the hands of frail children. She could still hear his laughter, his warm voice saying, "No one leaves here with an empty stomach." Her lips trembled as she lifted her voice toward Jessica. "Please, Mom, give me a plate of food, just like the meals Dad used to make for the children." The words cut through the air like a blade. Jessica, sitting beside Jack and chatting with several guests, instantly changed her expression. She slammed her wineglass down on the table, the sharp crack of glass startling everyone around her. Her voice hissed through clenched teeth, cold and sharp. "You want to embarrass me here? My daughter, begging for food in a place like this?" Jack tilted his chin, lips curling with disdain. He shot up from his chair, pointed straight at Charlotte, and shouted loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "Beggar, look at you, all ragged like that, and you dare set foot in here? Get out!" The room fell silent. A few guests turned their heads, whispering among themselves. In the corner, a little boy, an orphan who had once been fed for free by Christopher, murmured softly to his friend, That's his daughter. He was the one who used to feed us." Charlotte heard it, and her heart ached. She clenched the old scarf in her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks, yet she still tried to plead. "Please, Mom, I'm so hungry. I only want a little portion." Jessica smirked coldly. Suddenly, her hand seized Charlotte's hair and yanked her toward the door. The sharp clicks of her heels echoed on the floor, blending with the girl's sobs. The crowd looked on, some startled enough to take a step forward, but they froze, afraid of causing a scandal. Out on the steps, Jack lost his temper and shoved her hard. The small body fell, her white dress dragging across the ground, smeared with mud. Charlotte curled into herself, clutching the worn scarf tightly. Jessica wasn't finished. She grabbed a box of leftovers from the table and dumped it all over the child. French fries, chicken bones, and crumbs scattered, sticking to her tangled hair, clinging to her tear-streaked face. Jack roared, spitting out each word like venom. "If you want to eat, then eat. Filthy beggar." Charlotte gasped through sobs, sitting in the puddle of mud and scraps. She lifted her head, her blue eyes swimming with tears, searching desperately for someone to reach out. But the crowd only stood frozen, their eyes caught between pity and fear. The air grew suffocating. All that remained was the sound of a child weeping, humiliated by the very people meant to protect her. Just then, the low growl of an engine shattered the silence. A luxury car slowed to a stop at the steps. Its headlights swept across the scene, stirring a murmur through the crowd. The car door opened. Out stepped a man in his mid-40s, tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His angular face was marked by depth and gravity, his calm presence carrying the weight of a life well tested. The moment he stopped, his eyes locked on the sight before him. A small girl in a white dress, caked with mud, hair in disarray, cheeks wet with tears, her tiny frame surrounded by scattered scraps of food. The man's chest tightened. He froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. In his gaze, fury and compassion merged, rising together like fire. The crowd held its breath. In that instant, fate placed Charlotte and this man within the same frame, the beginning of a turning point that would change both their lives forever. The man's hand tightened slightly at his side. Then he walked straight through the frozen crowd. No one had time to react. They only watched the tall figure move toward the little girl, curled up on the ground. The steady sound of leather shoes echoed heavily, like the trembling heartbeat of little Charlotte. He stopped in front of her, removed his overcoat, and bent down to brush away the dirt clinging to her thin shoulders. Every movement was slow and careful, as if even the lightest touch might harm that fragile child. That man was Billy Herrera, a millionaire well known in the world of real estate. But more than that, he had once been an admirer of Christopher Morales's paintings. And now fate had brought him here, at the right time and place, to reach out to the abandoned child. His deep voice rang out, each word clear and firm. How could anyone dare to treat a child like this? The air went silent. Some diners who had been watching quickly lowered their heads. A few coughed awkwardly to avoid meeting his eyes. Jack frowned, about to speak, but Jessica quickly stepped in, switching to a sweet tone. You misunderstood. The girl was just being naughty, rolling on the ground and dirtying her dress. I was only teaching her a small lesson. Billy turned sharply toward her, his cold gaze making Jessica's confidence falter. He spoke slowly, not loudly, yet with undeniable weight. Don't lie. I knew Christopher. This girl, she is his daughter. Charlotte lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes trembling as she looked at the man who had just spoken her father's name. Her voice broke, quivering as if she feared losing her last chance. You knew my dad? Billy froze for a moment. In that brief silence, Christopher's image came back to him, a gentleman whose eyes always burned with passion when he stood before a canvas. Billy nodded, his voice firm, resonating like a promise. "Your father was the man I respected most." Tears streamed down Charlotte's face, but this time not only from sorrow. A spark of hope had just been lit. Her small hands trembled as they clutched the edge of the coat Billy had placed on her shoulders. Jessica could no longer contain herself, her face twisted with fury. She yanked at Charlotte's arm, dragging her back. "She's my child. No one else needs to interfere." Billy stepped forward, his steady hand brushing Jessica aside, his eyes leaving no room for resistance. "No, you lost that right long ago. From this day forward, I will take care of her. I will not allow Christopher's daughter to suffer one more humiliation." Jack lunged forward, his voice rough, dripping with challenge. "Who are you to interfere in someone else's family? Don't think money gives you the right to do whatever you want." Billy turned his head calmly, his eyes steady but cold. He spoke slowly, each word hitting Jack like a hammer. "There are things money can never buy. One of them is the respect owed to a child." A few guests shook their heads, and someone muttered, "What a disgrace, Mr. Morales' daughter being treated like this." Jessica heard it, her face flushed red, her heart pounding. She clenched her teeth, her voice choking with fury. "You think you can just take her away so easily? She is the rightful heir. I have every right." Billy did not argue. He bent down and lifted Charlotte into his arms. His embrace was steady, making the little girl stop trembling, her head resting against his shoulder as if she had finally found her last refuge. A black car was already parked nearby. The driver, Robert, a gray-haired man who had served Billy for many years, hurried over to open the door. Robert took in the scene, his eyes burning with anger. But he kept silent, knowing his employer always chose action over wasted words. Billy carried Charlotte down the steps without saying a thing. Jessica stood frozen, her painted lips trembling, her eyes blazing with hatred. Jack clenched his fists tight, but he didn't dare follow. Around them, the guests' eyes burned with contempt mixed with pity. Charlotte settled into the back seat, her small hands still clutching Billy's coat. The car slowly pulled away from the restaurant. Through the window, she saw Jessica, in her striking red dress, standing motionless, her eyes glowing with resentment, while Jack beside her gnashed his teeth, his face twisted with rage. Charlotte turned her face away, tears still clinging to her cheeks, but for the first time in months, her heart trembled with a new spark of hope. Beside her, Billy leaned in and spoke softly, his voice warm and steady. "From now on, no one will ever be allowed to hurt you again." The luxury car rolled away from the restaurant in silence. Streetlights stretched endlessly on both sides, their golden glow reflecting on Charlotte's innocent face. She sat curled up, her small hands clutching tightly at Billy's coat sleeve, as if it were the only anchor left for her in this world. Beside her, Billy remained quiet, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror to make sure the little girl was safe. Robert, the salt-and-pepper-haired driver, handled the wheel with care. He didn't say a word, but the sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable as he glanced at the fragile figure huddled in the back seat. The road opened toward the outskirts, trees on both sides whispering in the wind. When the car finally stopped in front of a large iron gate, Charlotte lifted her head. Her tear-streaked eyes widened in surprise. Before her stood a villa, not overly lavish, but radiating peace. Its walls were painted a soft cream, and the front garden bloomed with white roses whose gentle fragrance drifted through the night air. Charlotte felt something unfamiliar. The house didn't resemble Jessica's cold, distant world of power, but rather a home that seemed to breathe, a home with a soul. The gates slowly swung open. The car glided in and stopped before polished stone steps. The door clicked open, and Billy stepped out first, then leaned back to carry Charlotte in his arms. She clung to his shoulder, her heartbeat racing, torn between fear and curiosity. A middle-aged woman emerged from the house. She wore a simple dark dress, her figure neat, her hair tied up in a bun. On her kind face, a pair of warm eyes glowed with affection. She bent down and smiled softly. "Welcome, young lady. From today on, this will be your home." Charlotte stared at her in awe, her trembling voice barely audible. "Really? This "This will be my home?" The woman was Margaret, Billy's longtime housekeeper. She had witnessed him endure countless trials in life, and now her gentle gaze seemed to reach out to soothe the fragile soul standing before her. Margaret nodded tenderly, running a hand through Charlotte's tangled hair. "Yes, this is your home. Here, you will be safe." Charlotte fell silent, hugging her worn little notebook tightly to her chest. She dared not believe fully, afraid it was nothing but a dream that would vanish the moment she opened her eyes. Stepping inside, Charlotte was struck with wonder. The interior was simple yet warm, with soft golden lights filling the living room. The wooden shelves held a few carefully chosen paintings, all perfectly framed and spotless. Unlike the false grandeur of Jessica's house, this place seemed to carry the heartbeat of peace. Charlotte gently touched the soft sofa, a sensation both strange and safe washing over her. At dinner, the table was set simply. A steaming bowl of chicken soup, slices of crisp toasted bread, and a plate of steaming vegetables. Billy sat across from Charlotte, holding a spoon but looking slightly unsure. He watched her for a long moment, then gently added more soup to her bowl, his deep voice soft as he said, "Tell me what you like. Don't be afraid to ask." Charlotte lowered her head and whispered, I've never been asked that before." Billy froze. The short reply struck him straight in the heart. A child who should be asked every day what she wanted to eat, how she wanted to be cared for, had never once experienced such a simple gesture. He swallowed hard, hiding the sigh that rose in his chest, then forced a gentle smile. "Then tonight, just eat until you're full. From now on, no one will ever let you go hungry again." Charlotte hesitantly lifted the spoon to her mouth. The warmth of the chicken soup spread through her empty stomach. She ate slowly, one small bite at a time, her eyes glancing at Billy as if waiting for him to change his mind. But Billy only sat patiently, occasionally placing more vegetables or a cut piece of bread onto her plate. His kind gaze was so steady that Charlotte began to feel safe. After the meal, Billy stood up and motioned for Charlotte to follow him. He led her upstairs and opened the door to a room. It was modest in size, with pale blue walls and a window that looked out onto a rose garden. On the wooden desk sat a small lamp casting a warm golden glow, and on the pillow rested a brand new teddy bear. Charlotte stepped inside, stunned. She turned to Billy and whispered, This room is for me." Billy nodded, his voice deep, yet steady. "Yes, you need a space of your own, a place where you belong." The little girl trembled and walked slowly toward the large desk. On the wall hung a painting. Charlotte instantly recognized the familiar brushstrokes. It was one of her father's unpublished works. The image showed a girl sitting by a window, the glow of the evening sun lighting her face with radiant hope. Her hand shook as she touched the wooden frame, her voice breaking. Dad painted this, but he never showed it to me." Billy stepped closer and rested his hand gently on her shoulder. His eyes glistened as he looked at the painting, his voice low. "Did you know, years ago I used to run a children's foundation, but work and ambition made me forget it. It was your father who convinced me to start again, to breathe life back into it with his own hands. I remember during our visits to the children, he would always bring his brushes and sketch for them, while I just stood quietly watching. We talked a lot in those days, and I realized he put his heart into everything he did. From then on, I considered him one of the rare true friends in my life." Charlotte listened, her eyes filling with tears. She clutched her notebook tightly and whispered as if in reply, "My dad, he always thought of others first." Billy nodded, his voice catching. "He once told me, this painting was meant for the one who understood his heart the most, and now it has found the place where it belongs." Charlotte bit her lip, tears streaming down her face, but a faint smile broke through. For the first time, she cried not only out of sadness, but because she felt the touch of something familiar, like a message sent from her father. She sat down at the desk, opened her notebook, and wrote a short line. "I have found someone who will protect me." The page trembled under her small hand, the ink blurred by tears, but her blue eyes shone for the first time in months. She closed the notebook, placed it on the desk, then slipped under the blanket. The soft lamplight fell across her innocent face, her lips still moving in a faint murmur. "Thank you, Uncle Billy." Outside the grand gate, night had fallen. A strange car pulled up in the shadows. The window was left half open, the red tip of a cigarette glowing in the dark. Inside, someone sat silently watching the mansion, their gaze cold as steel. Jessica had not given up. She had sent someone to follow, waiting for her chance. Inside the room, Charlotte slept peacefully for the first time in days. But outside, danger lingered in the air, like darkness waiting to devour the fragile light that had just been lit. The next morning, Charlotte opened her eyes in the new room. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, spilling across the spotless white sheets. She blinked a few times, still unsure if this was real and not just a dream. There was no longer the stench of alcohol and heavy makeup. No more shouting echoing from the hall downstairs. Only birdsong and the faint aroma of toasted bread drifting from the kitchen below. A gentle knock sounded on the door. Billy appeared, holding a cup of warm milk. He set the tray down on the small table, his voice deep yet kind. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Charlotte gave a slight nod. Hugging the pillow, her eyes still shone with cautious wariness. Billy noticed, so he reached out to adjust the curtains, letting the sunlight pour in, then turned back with a smile. "Today I'd like to take you somewhere special before we head out. Would you like to go?" Charlotte hesitated, then nodded again. Billy led her to a room that had been cleaned up the night before. He opened the door, revealing a bright, airy space. Sunlight fell across a large wooden table where a brand new set of oil paints sat, still wrapped in plastic. The scent of fresh paint mingled with the smell of new wood, giving the room a feeling that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Billy looked a little unsure, rubbing his hands together. "I've never painted before, but maybe you could show me how?" Charlotte froze. Her eyes widened, lashes fluttering. Then she whispered, her voice echoing the memory of her father's words. "Dad used to say, if you mix green with yellow, you'll get the color of hope." She picked up a brush, her hand trembling as she stirred the two shades together. Billy sat quietly, watching each small movement. He could see that her thin little hand no longer shook from fear, but from excitement. For the first time in many weeks, fear was giving way to anticipation. Billy smiled faintly. In his eyes, Christopher's figure seemed to appear for a moment, as if he were still there, watching over his daughter. A few days later, Billy decided to take Charlotte outside. They went to an orphanage on the outskirts of the city, a place Christopher had often visited. The three-story building was old, its plaster walls peeling in spots, but the small courtyard was clean and full of children's laughter. When the car stopped, Charlotte clutched tightly at Billy's sleeve. He bent down and whispered, "You don't need to be afraid. We're only here to visit some friends." Charlotte nodded softly, still hiding behind his back. Billy handed her a bag of sweet pastries that still carried the warm scent of milk. The little girl held it with trembling hands, taking slow, hesitant steps forward. A boy of about 7 years old looked up, his eyes bright. He accepted the bag of cookies from Charlotte and said in a clear voice, "Thank you, sister." Charlotte froze. Her lips, which had remained tightly pressed for so long, curved slightly as a fragile smile bloomed. Her eyes shimmered as if she had just rediscovered something familiar. From a distance, Billy watched silently. In that moment, he realized Charlotte had just crossed an invisible threshold, moving from fear to hope. On the way home, the atmosphere inside the car was filled with an unusual peace. Billy tilted his head and spoke slowly. "You just did something wonderful." Charlotte lowered her head, her voice faint as if afraid the wind might carry it away. "I only did what you once did." Billy shook his head, his gaze steady. "Number, you gave it away on your own, and that is the greatest thing of all." Charlotte remained silent, her cheeks gradually turning pink. She turned her face toward the car window, but her lips pressed together in a subtle smile. At that very moment, in a small cafe across from the orphanage, a young man set his camera down on the table. His name was Daniel Cruz, 25 years old, a rookie freelance journalist. Daniel had slightly long hair, wore round glasses, and had a slender build, hardly the look of a hardened news chaser. But his eyes were sharp, always searching for a genuine story in the midst of life. Through the lens, Daniel had just captured the instant Billy carried Charlotte out of the gate. The little girl rested her head on his shoulder, her faint smile brimming with hope. Lowering the camera, Daniel felt a stir in his heart. "This picture, it's not just news," he murmured. "It's proof that even in a cold world, there is still room for kindness." That evening, the photograph appeared on the homepage of a local online newspaper. Beneath the picture, a bold headline read, "Daughter of painter Christopher Morales abandoned, now taken in by a millionaire." The article spread quickly. Readers who once admired Christopher left comments. "His daughter is so pitiful. At least someone is protecting her." Others sighed. "God is fair. At least the girl is not left alone." In Jessica's luxurious mansion, the newspaper was hurled violently to the floor. The crash of a wine glass echoed, red liquid spilling across the tiles like blood. Jessica stood breathing heavily, her face flushed. Her blonde hair was disheveled. Her smeared lipstick made her look like a different person entirely. The newspaper photo showed Charlotte clearly, nestled in Billy's arms, her eyes shining as if she had found life again. Jessica ground her teeth, spitting out each word. "That brat dared to humiliate me in front of the whole city. She will pay for this." Jack, sitting across from her, started to speak but fell silent when he met Jessica's eyes. In those eyes, hatred blazed fiercely, signaling that a storm was about to descend. Outside the window, the night pressed down heavily. In that darkness, Jessica's fury had just planted the seed of a new plan for revenge, one that could drag everyone into a dangerous spiral. In the grand living room of Jessica's mansion, the heavy curtains were drawn shut, blocking out the daylight. The air was thick with the smell of liquor and cigarette smoke. On the glossy wooden table, instead of flowers or books, as in Christopher's time, there were now only glass cups, half-empty bottles of wine, and a messy pile of documents. Jessica sat at the head of the table, her face expressionless but her eyes bloodshot from countless sleepless nights. She slammed her hand against the table, making the wine glass tremble. Her voice came out hoarse, yet filled with rage. "If that little girl is under Billy's protection, we must prove she has no right to inherit. Otherwise, everything we've taken will vanish into thin air." Doña Teresa Aguilar, a plump woman in her 50s who had once managed Christopher's charitable foundation, leaned on the table with a sly look in her eyes. "That's not difficult. All we need is to invent a few financial violations, or some document claiming she isn't his legitimate daughter. The public is quick to believe such things." At the corner of the table, Ramirez, a middle-aged lawyer with slick-back hair and a neatly buttoned gray suit, raised his glass and took a slow sip. His voice was low but precise. "I can forge the documents. One red stamp, a few numbers, a fake signature, and it becomes legal. But remember, if we are exposed, the entire group will face prison." Jack, still looking suave in his unbuttoned shirt, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and let out a mocking laugh. "Don't forget, Billy has enough money to hire 10 of the best lawyers. If we make even the smallest mistake, he'll crush us without effort." The tension in the room thickened. Claudia Mendoza, a beautiful young woman with long black hair and cold eyes, crossed her legs and spoke calmly, her tone laced with confidence. "Don't worry, the media is in my hands. A bad story disappears if a better distraction comes along. I know how to make the public look elsewhere, even start doubting Billy." Jessica's gaze swept across each face. Her eyes burned with hatred, her voice dropping low, sharp as a blade. "Then, we begin now. That girl will never live in peace under the name Morales." The entire room fell silent. Outside the window, the night wind blew, making the candle flames flicker and casting light on the faces around the table, faces of people willing to use every deceitful trick to strangle the life of a 6-year-old child. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Charlotte was walking with Billy to school. It was her first day back after a long stretch of turmoil. The school sat on a narrow street, its yellow lime-washed walls worn with age, yet the sound of children's laughter still echoed across the courtyard. Charlotte stepped out of the car, clutching her notebooks tightly, her mind in turmoil. She feared the stares of her classmates, the whispers she had already heard with her own ears. The moment she walked through the gate, the murmurs rose clearly around her. "Isn't that the beggar girl from the other day?" Yeah, that's her. The paper even said she was taken in by a millionaire. Charlotte lowered her head, her small hands gripping the notebook until her knuckles turned white. Her ears burned, each whisper slicing into her heart like a knife. She tried to walk faster, but the voices clung to her like shadows. Billy noticed. He bent slightly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his eyes tender as if to say, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." But before he could speak, a stern voice rang out from the hallway. Silence. A man in his 40s stepped forward, tall and lean, streaks of gray in his hair, his crisp white shirt tucked neatly. It was Mr. Lopez, a veteran teacher known for his sternness but also for his fairness. He approached, fixing his eyes on the group of whispering students. "Have you all forgotten who once supported this school? This is the daughter of Christopher Morales. No one has the right to humiliate her. Everyone, back to your classrooms at once." The courtyard fell silent. Heads lowered, a few children's faces flushed with shame. Charlotte stood still, her eyes glistening as she looked at the unfamiliar teacher who had chosen to defend her. A small voice stirred inside her. "Daddy, I'm not alone anymore." Billy nodded slowly, gratitude shining in his eyes. Mr. Lopez gave only a slight nod in return, then placed a firm but kind hand on Charlotte's shoulder, his deep voice steady. "You are the daughter of a man of honor. Remember, you deserve respect too." Charlotte bit her lip and gave a small nod. A new spark of light quietly began to grow inside her. That night, Charlotte slept peacefully in the room where her father's painting still hung on the wall. Billy sat alone in the study, the desk lamp casting light over the stack of files on the charity foundation he was planning to reopen. He believed this was the best way to preserve Christopher's legacy, and also to give Charlotte a reason to be proud of her father. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Robert went to answer it, then returned with a brown envelope. There was no messenger, it had simply been left at the gate. Billy opened the envelope. Inside were neatly printed pages stamped with a glaring red seal. His eyes froze on the bold words, "Charlotte Morales has no inheritance rights." His fingers clenched the paper until it crumpled. His breathing quickened. He knew all too well this was one of Jessica's vile schemes with her accomplices. In the brightly lit room, Billy sat motionless, the forged document trembling in his hand. Outside the window, the night pressed in heavy and dark. He understood then the battle to protect Charlotte had only just begun. The small room inside Billy's mansion was silent. That night, Charlotte tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. The soft yellow light of the bedside lamp cast a glow over her face, her big round eyes squeezing shut now and then only to open again. On the pillow lay the brand new notebook Billy had bought for her, untouched, as she had no desire to write a single word. Her mind kept returning to one thing only, her father's sketchbook. Inside were drawings he had made just for her, from the time she was learning to walk until she could finally hold a brush. She remembered every shaky pencil line, every message her father had written in blue ink. "Every color you paint carries your soul." Charlotte bit her lip and hugged her pillow tight. "At last," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Uncle Billy, I want to get my dad's sketchbook back." Billy was in his study, yet he heard her clearly. He stood, walked into the room, and looked at the little girl for a long moment. In those teary blue eyes, he saw a yearning and a pain that had never faded. He sighed, then sat down beside the bed, resting his hand on her soft hair. "Are you sure? Going back there won't be easy." Charlotte nodded firmly, her voice quiet but certain. "I need it. I can't let them keep it." Billy was silent for a while. At last he nodded, his voice deep, like a promise. "If you need it, then we'll go." Charlotte's eyes lit up, glimmering with hope. 2 days later, night had fallen. Billy's black car quietly turned onto the familiar road that led to the old Morales estate. The air was thick with mist, and the cold night wind slipped through the cracks of the window. Charlotte sat pressed close beside Billy, clutching tightly to his coat. Her heart pounded, filled with both fear and anticipation. The car stopped a short distance from the gate. The mansion appeared under the dim moonlight, its roof tiles covered in moss, the shadows wrapping it like a slumbering beast. The house that once held sweet memories had become a place of nightmares. Billy bent down, took Charlotte's hand, and reminded her in a firm voice, "We'll go in, grab the sketchbook, and leave right away. You must stay right next to me, understood?" Charlotte swallowed hard and nodded quickly. The rusty iron gate creaked open. From the guardhouse, an old figure emerged, Don Aurelio. He had once been Christopher's loyal gatekeeper, but now, with age and hardship pressing on him, he had no choice but to continue working under Jessica's command. When his eyes fell on Billy, he flinched in surprise. Billy placed a finger on his lips. Don Aurelio hesitated, his old eyes glimmering with sorrow. He pretended to turn away, his back bending as if he had seen nothing. Charlotte froze. Inside her heart, a fragile warmth stirred. There were still people here who had not turned their backs on her father. The long hallway stretched out under the moonlight filtering through the windows, its faded carpet carrying the faint echo of Billy's footsteps, blending with the frantic beating of Charlotte's heart. She trembled when she stopped before the door of the studio. Billy pushed it open. Inside, the familiar smell of oil paint still lingered. The paintings her father once hung were gone, leaving behind only bare frames. On the wooden table, an old sketchbook and a worn paintbrush still rested there, as if waiting for Charlotte's small hands to return. She rushed forward and clutched the sketchbook tightly against her chest. Tears streamed down her face, soaking the frayed corners of the pages. Her voice came out in a choked whisper. "Dad, I found it again." Billy placed his hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening. He knew how much this moment meant to Charlotte. But just as they were about to leave, angry voices echoed down the distant hallway. Jack roared, his voice hoarse from drink. "You're too greedy, Jessica. You've swallowed up the trust fund, and now you want to take the inheritance too?" Jessica's voice hissed back, shrill and venomous. "It's all mine. That brat should have died with her father. She's the reason I lost all my honor." Charlotte stiffened. Each word was sharp, like a blade stabbing her small heart. She clutched the sketchbook tighter, sobs catching in her throat. Her whole body shook, her eyes brimming with tears. Billy looked down and saw the pain flooding her gaze. He bent closer, whispering urgently, "That's enough, child. Let's go." Charlotte gave a faint nod, but her legs still trembled. They hurried down the hall, careful to keep silent. As they neared the door, Jessica suddenly turned her head. In the large mirror hanging on the wall, a faint reflection revealed Charlotte holding the sketchbook, her eyes wide with terror. Jessica froze, her eyes sparking with fury. She gripped the banister tightly, her voice grinding through clenched teeth. The girl, how much did she hear? Jack frowned and turned to look, but Jessica was already grinding her teeth, her face twisted with hatred. "Tomorrow," she hissed. "I'll erase her forever." Out in the courtyard, Billy hurried Charlotte toward the car. She sobbed, clutching the sketchbook tightly to her chest. From the darkened house behind them, Jessica's eyes still followed through the glass window, like a hidden blade silently promising a storm of terrifying revenge. News exploded overnight. Major newspapers simultaneously blasted eye-catching headlines. Christopher Morales Foundation embezzled suspicions of lawyers' involvement. The entire city buzzed with shock. Those who once admired Christopher were stunned. People who had eaten a free meal at his charity restaurant wept, torn between grief and anger. Television ran non-stop footage of the foundation being shut down, orphans standing confused before the locked gates. Questions piled up. Who would dare betray the legacy of a man who had devoted his whole life to the poor? Billy sat in his study, gripping the crumpled newspaper so tightly it nearly tore. Charlotte sat beside him, her eyes filled with fear. "Uncle, they're lying, aren't they? My dad's foundation, it couldn't be like that." Billy placed his hand firmly on her shoulder, his voice steady. "That's right, sweetheart. The truth will come out, and those who did wrong will pay the price." The police wasted no time. Leading the operation was Inspector Delgado, a man in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, his neatly trimmed beard framing eyes as sharp and cold as steel. He was known throughout the force as the Hammer of Justice, a man who never bowed to power. He personally led his team straight into attorney Ramirez's office. Inside the luxurious room, Ramirez was frantically trying to erase files from his computer. His face dripped with sweat, His tie hung loose, and he muttered under his breath, "Just a few more minutes. Wipe everything clean and no one will find a trace." The door burst open. Delgado strode in, his voice booming. "Ramirez, you are under arrest for falsifying documents and aiding in embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent, but everything you've done has already been recorded." Ramirez's face drained of color, his eyes darting around for an escape. Two officers lunged forward, twisting his arms behind his back. Cold steel cuffs snapped shut on his wrists. Camera flashes from reporters exploded across the room. The first photos hit the presses that very night. Prominent attorney Ramirez arrested in his office. Another police unit struck directly at the home of Doña Teresa Aguilar. The heavyset woman sat comfortably in her armchair, gold rings glittering on her fingers, a grin on her face as she counted a thick stack of fresh bills. She jolted in panic when the door was kicked open. "Doña Teresa Aguilar, you are under arrest for embezzling charity funds and personal profiteering," she thrashed and screamed. "No, this is my money. I was only holding it for safekeeping." But her voice was drowned out by the clinking of handcuffs. She was dragged out under the blinding flashes of cameras, her face twisted with shame. Neighbors gathered to watch, whispering, "Turns out she's been pocketing money meant for orphans all this time." That image spread everywhere, leaving those who once trusted her consumed with fury. Claudia Mendoza did not escape either. Secret files exposing how she staged media distractions to cover scandals were leaked. Social media exploded. Claudia Mendoza, a doll made to mislead the public, a manipulator of the truth. Thousands of angry comments poured in. Brands cut ties one after another. Claudia's luxurious apartment was surrounded by reporters. The once arrogant young woman who thrived before the cameras now hid in the shadows, mascara smeared, her phone vibrating non-stop with messages full of insults. Jack saw it all and chose the path he always did, running away. He abandoned Jessica, drained the bank account, and disappeared. People spotted him in a dingy bar, reeking of alcohol, disheveled. The man who once dressed sharp and spoke smoothly was now just a broken shadow, too afraid to show his face in the light. And then came Jessica. When the police stormed in, she had no one left by her side. In the vast house, Jessica screamed, pulling at her own hair, her eyes bloodshot. "It's all because of that little brat. Because of her. She destroyed my life." But no one answered. The cold walls echoed only with her desperate screams. Her assets were frozen. Friends, lovers, accomplices all gone. Jessica was left with nothing but herself, alone in the ruins. The glamorous red dresses she once flaunted lay crumpled, high heels with broken straps tossed into the corner. Day after day, she wandered the streets. The admiring glances of the past had turned to scorn. She became a shadow of herself, dragging along under eaves, begging for scraps of bread. One afternoon, the rain poured down in sheets. Raindrops hammered against the tiles of Billy's mansion, the sound echoing endlessly. A faint, weak knock came at the gate. Margaret, the housekeeper, went to open it. Standing before her was Jessica. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, soaked and plastered to her cheeks. Her smeared makeup revealed a hollow, gaunt face. Her voice was hoarse, trembling. "Please, just a bite to eat." Margaret froze. Memories of Jessica cursing at Charlotte rushed back. Hatred stirred in her chest, yet her hand hesitated, not closing the door. Inside the house, Charlotte heard. The girl stepped out, holding a still warm loaf of bread. Her face no longer carried fear, only calm resolve. Charlotte walked forward, placed the bread into Jessica's trembling hands, and spoke softly, her tone steady but firm. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Jessica stood frozen. Her hands shook as she clutched the loaf. Rain mixed with her tears, streaming down her distorted face. She lowered her head, unable to look into Charlotte's clear blue eyes. Moments later, Jessica staggered away, each step heavy, fading into the downpour. Charlotte stood watching, while the loaf of bread in Jessica's hands still radiated warmth, yet her figure slowly vanished behind the cold rain. No one knew if that moment marked the beginning of repentance or a descent into an even deeper abyss. The rain had stopped for many days. The city returned to its usual rhythm, But inside Charlotte, the storm that had just passed left an indelible mark. The image of Jessica, drenched in the rain, trembling as she clutched a loaf of bread, her eyes filled with tears, still lingered vividly in Charlotte's memory. Yet instead of fear, this time Charlotte felt something different. Release. A few weeks later, a new day began. Golden sunlight stretched across the busy streets. Billy's car turned into the city center and stopped in front of a gleaming glass building the venue of the exhibition, Resurrection. Today was not just an art event, it was also a milestone in an entire journey. Billy adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. He was not a man accustomed to standing before crowds, but today he needed to be present. Beside him, Charlotte sat quietly, her small hands tightly gripping her father's old sketchbook. She carried it as if it were a talisman. Inside, the exhibition hall was spacious, with a high ceiling and golden lights casting their glow on the neatly hung paintings. The atmosphere carried something sacred. Attendees had come from everywhere. Journalists, collectors, people who had once known Christopher, and even the orphans he had once cared for. At the center of the room, standing out among all else, was the painting Resurrection. It was the piece Billy and Charlotte had completed together through long, quiet nights. Green strokes intertwined with radiant yellows, overflowing with vitality. Green symbolized hope, yellow symbolized light. It was like the sun rising after a storm. Helena Cruz, the exhibition curator, approached. She was in her 60s, slender, with neatly pinned silver hair. Her eyes held both gravity and gentleness. She had once been a friend of Christopher in the art world, and one of the first to believe in his talent. She looked at Charlotte, her voice breaking with emotion. "I have been watching you from afar. In every brushstroke, I see Christopher. You have brought him back with your own hands." Charlotte lifted her face and gave a small nod. Her cheeks flushed pink, but her eyes sparkled. She whispered, "Dad is always here. I'm only continuing what he left behind." Billy stood behind her, his eyes brimming with pride. As the exhibition began, groups of orphans poured in. The children wore simple uniforms, their eyes shining brightly. On the long tables, meals had been carefully prepared: steaming chicken soup, toasted bread, sliced fruit. The scene evoked memories of the days when Christopher was still alive, when he opened his restaurant to serve free meals to children in need. A small boy hugged his plate of food, then ran to grab Charlotte's hand. "Thank you, sister. I was so hungry, but now I am full." Charlotte bent down gently, smoothing the boy's tangled hair. A pure smile appeared on her lips, a smile no longer shadowed by darkness. Billy stood in the corner, his eyes suddenly blurred. He felt as if he were witnessing a miracle. For so many years, he had lived wealthy, but alone. Now, surrounded by the sound of laughter, he finally understood the true meaning of the word family. He stepped closer and spoke softly to Charlotte. "You have given me a family." Charlotte looked up, her blue eyes filled with light. She placed her hand on the painting Resurrection and said in her clear, ringing voice, "Daddy, I have found my laughter again." The room fell silent. No one could speak. They gazed at the little girl as though Christopher himself had come back to life. In their eyes, his legacy had not died, but was carried forward through the heart and hands of his daughter. Mrs. Helena dabbed at the corner of her eyes, her voice trembling. "Christopher, you are still here, and your daughter is the proof." Children's laughter echoed through the gallery. The press captured every moment. Photographs of Charlotte handing out meals, of Billy wiping sweat from a child's forehead, of the painting Resurrection bursting with color, spread across social media. The public was moved. People passed the message to one another. In the end, goodness prevails. Christopher's legacy has been reborn. As the ceremony drew to a close, the golden light of dusk bathed the tall glass windows. Charlotte stood in the hall, now quiet after the crowd had left. She clasped Billy's hand tightly and whispered, "From now on, I am no longer alone." Billy bent down, gently tightening his grip around her hand. He said nothing more, because there was no need. Everything had already been answered in that moment, through warmth, through color, and through the laughter that had finally returned after such a long journey. Many years had passed since the resurrection exhibition. Time had moved quietly but left deep marks. Charlotte was no longer the fragile little girl she once was. She had grown up under Billy's protection, spending her days studying and working with children in need. Now, Charlotte Morales had become a well-known social worker. She didn't choose to hide behind the glory of her late father's reputation or the wealth of her foster father. Instead, she threw herself into poor neighborhoods, underfunded shelters, and broken-down rural schools. She was often seen in a simple white blouse, her hair tied neatly back, a stack of documents in her arms. But what people remembered most wasn't her appearance. It was her bright blue eyes, filled with faith and compassion. She spoke to children as if she were speaking to her younger self, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not alone. I once thought I had been abandoned too, but I wasn't. Someone reached out a hand to me. And now, I want to be that person for you." Billy, now in his 50s, still walked beside Charlotte. He no longer busied himself in the business world, choosing instead to devote his energy to the Christopher Morales Foundation. Whenever Charlotte organized a trip, he quietly took care of logistics, finances, and the support network. At one conference about street children, a reporter asked Charlotte, "Why do you choose such a demanding career instead of enjoying a life of comfort?" Charlotte smiled, her eyes glowing with pride. "Because I was once a child trembling outside a closed gate. I know what that feels like, and I don't want anyone else to go through it again. I do this not only for myself, but for my father, for the man who raised me, and for every child still waiting for a hand to reach out." Billy sat in the audience, silently wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. He realized that the little girl who had once clung to him in despair had now become a strong woman, ready to hold the hands of others. Every Christmas, Charlotte hosted a warm gathering in the very same exhibition hall from years before. Orphaned children poured in, their laughter filling the room. On the wall, the painting Resurrection still hung, vibrant through the years. Charlotte often paused before the painting, placing her hand on its green and yellow strokes, whispering, "Dad, I kept my promise. I found my laughter again, and now I'm giving it away." Billy stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder, smiling. "And you are no longer alone, my daughter." The lights sparkled, the music swelled, and small hands reached out to intertwine with Charlotte's. She understood that her life had been reborn, not only through miracles, but through love, persistence, and the unshakable belief that goodness will always have a place in this world. My dear friend, the story comes to a close with Charlotte's innocent smile as she finally found peace beside her adoptive father. The cruel ones like Jessica, Ramirez, and Doña Teresa all paid the price for their greed and wrongdoing. Meanwhile, love and compassion opened a new path, guiding the little girl out of the darkness and into the light. This is the noble message we want to share. Evil may run wild for a while, but in the end, justice and goodness will always prevail. Do you feel your heart soften when you see Charlotte offering a warm loaf of bread to the very person who once tormented her? What do you think about forgiveness? Is it perhaps the greatest strength that allows a person to move forward? And if it were you, in Billy's place, would you have the courage to reach out your hand to lift up a child who is a complete stranger? I truly want to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below, share how you feel, or simply let me know where you are watching this video from. I genuinely care about every viewer of Story for Heart because it is you who give me the strength to continue telling these heartwarming stories, these touching stories like this one. Thank you for staying with me. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Story for Heart so you won't miss the next journey.